This is the Society for Community Research and Action Criminal Justice Learning Community Series from January 16th, 2018. The presenters are Valerie Anderson and Laura Rubio.
So we're going to talk a little bit about this mixed methods evaluation that Laura and myself have been working on over the last few months. In the project description that was sent out, we kind of talked about how this project was really originally designed and written for a criminal justice audience, and kind of with that in mind, as well as kind of with practitioners working in the juvenile justice system. But we're kind of interested in kind of integrating as much as we can a community psychology perspective and kind of lens to this work. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about what we've done and the results from this study and kind of what we have so far. And then we're excited to get some feedback from all of you and kind of tell you a little about some future directions for this particular project. So we are going to give you a very brief overview of kind of what we know about girls in the juvenile justice system, why it's important to study and understand kind of the context of girls involved in the juvenile justice system. We will tell you a little bit about the research and evaluation site and kind of the context of that relationship with those community partners. And then we will tell you about the quantitative data and some of the results from the quantitative portion of the evaluation, and then we'll go over some of the qualitative data that we have and some kind of preliminary findings and kind of how we're framing and kind of approaching that analysis and a little bit of those kind of preliminary results. And then, like I said, we should have a good amount of time for discussion and some next steps with this project. So over the last couple of decades, we have seen an increased proportion of girls in the juvenile justice system. And this has been primarily kind of one of the main kind of driving forces of this is that we've seen an increase in girls arrested for simple assaults, oftentimes in the context of either family violence, domestic violence, or kind of dating violence and relationships. So we've seen this increased kind of uptick of girls in the justice system. So over the last number of years, we've seen really scholars advocating for understanding, not only kind of what is causing this and what is driving this and kind of some of the needs and risk factors that girls have, but really kind of what works and what are the best kinds of interventions to promote well-being among young women who do end up in the justice system, and certainly reduce rates of reoffending and promote girls' strengths. One thing that we do know from some of the literature kind of broadly on the juvenile justice system is really the importance of family-based interventions for youth and family-focused interventions for youth. And this seems particularly important for girls who are involved in the justice system, kind of one, given the context oftentimes of their offending, but also, thinking about the context of girls' relationships with their family members and romantic partners, and this kind of relational focus seems to be especially important to address with justice-involved girls. And kind of with all that said, there's really limited kind of empirical evaluation research using either experimental or quasi-experimental research designs on understanding kind of what works specifically for girls involved in the justice system and program evaluations of programming for girls who are wrapped up in the juvenile justice system. So to give you a little context about the research site and the evaluation site, this is all of the data come from one Midwestern juvenile county court system. This particular county court system has done a pretty nice job of trying to implement what best practices and kind of what we know about what works well with reducing offending among juvenile offenders. For those of you who are familiar with kind of the criminal justice and kind of corrections literature, they really adhere to this risk needs responsivity, or the R&R model, in which juvenile courts need to identify youth risk factors and their needs when they come into contact with the system and respond accordingly and match services kind of to their level of risk and to their specific sets of needs. So this court system has done a pretty nice job over really the last decade of implementing this kind of best practice R&R model. I have had an ongoing research and evaluation partnership with this particular court system for, at this point, over 7 years. And one thing that this particular court has been interested in over the last few years is evaluating the effectiveness of the programs and the services that they're implementing. Most often, this data, what it looks like is kind of administrative records or existing records. And oftentimes this is quantitative in nature. So we can look at these risk scores that youth might receive on these assessments when they come into contact with the juvenile court, and connect that to recidivism data or reoffense data. And over the years that they've been implementing this kind of model and this best practices model, they've been able to collect a lot of data, both this risk data and this recidivism data, and match it with what youth receive, what programs and what services. So now they have some capacity to actually do some evaluation research. So one of the more kind of recent kind of outgrowths of this and this partnership we've had with them is them saying, well, what works, in our program, what are in our services, what programs are actually making some kind of an impact, and where can we, improve our services. So we decided, among a few other kind of evaluation projects that we've had ongoing, one of the things that we have wanted to do is evaluate this family-based intervention that the court implemented, specifically with juvenile justice involved girls. So we are using a mixed methods design, using a dominant sequential approach, in which really kind of the dominant or the kind of primary method and data that we're using is this quantitative data, this risk and recidivism data for girls who received this program. And also we have some qualitative data that we're looking to kind of weave into this project, in which we have kind of in-depth interviews with folks who work in this particular juvenile court system. And it can give us a little bit of insight kind of into understanding kind of what they think about working with girls, girls' family-based needs, as well as tell us a little bit more about the actual program and components of that program. And kind of overall, the purpose of this kind of general study is to really understand whether or not this family-based intervention that they're using actually reduces recidivism or reoffense rates among court-involved girls. So what is this particular program that the court is interested in evaluating? So it is, like I said, a family-based intervention, and really kind of broadly, kind of one of the goals of the program is to provide kind of more support for court-involved youth, with really a focus on creating a more stable and structured home environment for young people, particularly those with higher criminogenic risk and needs. And criminogenic risk and needs are those factors that are kind of the strongest predictors of reoffending. So for the most part, youth who receive these kinds of interventions typically have higher levels of risk factors and needs, or those criminogenic risks. So the main kind of focus of the intervention is really skill-based, in kind of going through what the information that we have about the particular program and about the specific program kind of content, is that it's very similar to functional family therapy, family functional therapy, in which the main focus is really around kind of parenting, collaborating with the families, as well as trying to mobilize some more community resources as well. And so this is a community-based intervention. So youth who are, and girls who receive this program are on probation, right? So they're not in detention, or they're not incarcerated in a residential facility. And usually it's, the service is delivered at home, in which they have weekly meetings with the juvenile probation officers. And they are also assigned to, parents have to go to parenting classes, and they also have some kind of support groups as well. So I give all that kind of context about the program, and there's not that much information that we were actually given kind of at the outset about kind of what the program is. We really received about like a 1 or 2 page kind of report that kind of highlighted these kind of key components that they use. So it is very, they do try to tailor it kind of to the individual youth and their family, but it has these kind of general kind of components and structures. So you can probably all imagine that kind of given the limited amount of information about what we know about what's going on in this particular program, kind of eventually kind of pairing in some of our qualitative data can potentially provide us a little bit more insight in terms of what's actually going on in the program, and what juvenile probation officers are doing with youth and their families. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the quantitative study first, and our component of this study, and then we can go into some of this qualitative data. So we used a quasi-experimental design. The data were secondary data that were pulled from the court data management system. So during this period of time that they were implementing this risk and recidivism model, as well as this program, we pulled data from all girls who were involved in this Midwestern court system. And we also got a list of all the girls who obviously received this program and when they received this program. So we were able to have our kind of experimental or treatment group, and then because we also had this other data for girls who did not receive the intervention, we were able to create kind of a counterfactual group. So we used a propensity score matching design to create a matched comparison group. We were able to, of the 151 girls who received this program during this period of time, we were able to successfully match 101 pairs. So we have 101 girls who received the intervention, and then we have 101 girls who did not receive the intervention but were on probation at that same point in time, and have similar kind of risk factors and needs. So like I said, we used propensity score matching, and for those of you who are familiar with that particular process, we also ran a number of different sensitivity analyses and to try to see if we didn't lose as many cases. So we ended up losing 52 of the cases who did receive, the girls who did receive this intervention. So there was some kind of issues in terms of kind of sample reduction doing this process, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But this was kind of the best matching that we could do with this particular data set. In terms of the variables that we matched on these 8 different criminogenic risk and need domains based on this standardized risk measure that this juvenile court system used. It's called the Youth Level of Service Case Management Inventory. And those different domains include things like family and parenting, prior convictions, education, leisure and recreation. What else, Laura? What am I missing? Personality and behavior, attitudes and orientation. So all of these factors are considered to be the strongest predictors of reoffending among juvenile offenders. So we use these criminogenic risk scores as some of our matching covariates. We also use demographic factors, age, at initial contact with the court, whether they came into contact for a delinquency petition, or if they came into contact with the court for a status offense like truancy. And we also matched on race, ethnicity as well. And then our dependent variable of interest was recidivism, and that was defined as any new petition to court following 1 year following completion of the Family Support Services intervention. And this was just a binary outcome, yes or no, whether or not they had a new petition following the intervention. So in terms of the results, this was our final match sample of 101 girls who received the intervention and then the 101 girls who did not receive the intervention. On the under the covariates column on the left, all of the variables that are underlined, we saw significant differences between these two groups prior to matching them. So girls who received the intervention were significantly different based on age, based on prior offenses, education, leisure and recreation, peer relationships, and personality. So for example, the family domain, which hopefully this isn't too surprising, but for the family domain, the girls who received the intervention had significantly higher scores in this risk area than girls who did not receive the intervention. So that's kind of where we saw some of those differences. So once we were able to create this match sample, kind of one of the goals of kind of using this design is that we can eliminate at least some of those selection effects of who gets the intervention in contrast to who doesn't get the intervention, right? Because we know there's some kind of driving factors of kind of who gets these particular interventions and kind of how the court system will allocate their resources. So once we completed the matching process, you can see that we don't see significant differences anymore between these two groups, at least on this, this set of covariates that we measured. So based on then what we're trying to understand, at least kind of the first aim of this project is, does this intervention work in terms of reducing recidivism? What we found was that those in the family-based intervention, which is what that FSS label is, that's the youth who received the intervention, they did have lower recidivism rates 1 year out in contrast to the comparison group, but these were not significantly different, and you can see it's a very small effect size that we saw in terms of intervention effectiveness as measured by 1 year recidivism. So that's what we found in terms of our the quantitative portion of the study. So we kind of were like, well, what other information can we gather and can we get to kind of tell us more about kind of what was going on in that program? Is there anything else we can kind of examine to understand, this particular kind of evaluation problem in question? So we decided to look at some qualitative data that was collected in the same county court system. And this data was pulled from part of a larger study, really trying to understand how courts intervene and work with female juvenile offenders. So we collected 39 semi-structured interviews. A majority of those were with juvenile probation officers, direct service providers, and then there were a number of interviews that were also completed with other folks who worked in that juvenile court system. So like the court psychologist, judges, and kind of more administrative folks. So we wanted to kind of look through this particular interview data to see if it can tell us anything more, kind of add more to this evaluation of kind of what what does this program kind of include, as well as kind of what do folks who in this court system who are implementing this intervention, what do they think about kind of what girls' needs are, especially as it relates to kind of family-based needs. So this is kind of an ongoing piece. So we're looking forward to getting some feedback from all of you about this particular piece of the evaluation and maybe what we can glean from this set of data. But we are using kind of a broader kind of conventional content analysis approach, qualitative approach to analyzing this set of data. First, we read and reread these interviews and really went through to highlight where did folks in these interviews talk about girls and their families, and kind of highlighted all of that particular text. And then within that, we began to kind of identify some major themes and kind of emergent ideas from that data. And so there's kind of three major areas, and I'm going to pass this off to Laura to kind of tell you a little bit about what we found with this qualitative data.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Talk a little louder.
Okay, so basically we found three major areas in our qualitative analysis. One, practitioners' experiences in working with girls and their families. Two, practitioners' perceptions of girls' family needs. And three, components of FSS. So experiences with girls and their families, we found four major themes within that. Unstructured or chaotic home life. Many of them came from one-parent households. Many of them came from disadvantaged neighborhoods, poverty, for example, and family involvement in the criminal justice system. And we have a quote here. I mean, I had a case where the girl was living at home with her three siblings, all older. The one was in prison for like 2.5 years. The oldest one's in prison. The second one she was like prostituting herself. The other kid was on probation with us for 3 years. And I would go to the home, and the home environment is just awful. And she wasn't going to school either at the age of like 13. So then you move her to name of group home. They have a structured environment. They have someone meeting their needs constantly. Starts going to school. I mean, now she's going to court-run school and going daily and doing very well. So I think like the structured environment thing would be very important as well for a lot of the parents. All right, the next major theme, perceptions of girls' family needs. This includes girls having a very unstable home environment, leading to delinquent behavior. A lot of these girls, there's domestic violence in the home, and specifically girls fighting with their mothers. And we have an exemplary quote here. They're usually girls that, even if their family hasn't had official like neglect involvement, I would say that they come from a neglectful background. Again, whether it's been like officially substantiated or acknowledged that these domestic situations with girls and moms, I'm thinking of a couple of my kids right now, that usually results from, again, just years of a parent not really parenting and not having expectations or anything. And then the two get escalated and they don't even know how to resolve an argument in their household without throwing things at each other or fighting or putting their hands on each other. But again, when you get them, I mean, typically there's a history of, you know, being promiscuous, no like real stable schooling program, and marijuana, hanging out with other high-risk peers that are not really doing anything productive. But I would say it always boils down to a really unstable home environment. And lastly, components of the FSS program. Within this, we see that officers assess the risk needs of the family. Most of the family are impoverished. It has a strong parental focus and skills training, and it also includes goal setting. And our example quote here, after they have started at the academy, family support services, my job automatically gets placed for every single kid that comes here. The program is in place for at least 90 days. So within those 90 days, you meet with the parents and try to get a feel for how things are going in the home. Then we go over paperwork, like every other court thing. And after that, we establish goals. These goals are reflected on what the past JCO wants to do, wants to see with the family, my own interpretation of what needs to happen in the family, and then usually what the parents want to work on. Give them the choice what the third goal is going to be. A lot of times with goals, it is structure, rules in the home, and being able to follow through with those rules.
So as we kind of discussed, it's really important for us to, begin building some more literature on understanding kind of the context and outcomes of girls who are involved in the juvenile justice system. And this kind of framework in the study really kind of serves as, an example of that, and adds to some of the evaluation research. And it also can, I think, maybe shed a little bit of light onto, how we might be able to use kind of a mixed methods design to tell us a little bit more, particularly when we're using existing data sets. So kind of what we found, so far is that one, the qualitative data might be able to tell us a little bit about what might be missing and information that's missing from the quantitative evaluation. And we saw that, at least for the quantitative piece, that we see that there are slightly lower recidivism rates for the intervention group in girls on probation. And the qualitative data, we think, can provide a little bit more insight into kind of what's actually happening maybe with this intervention in practice, and maybe can provide us a little bit of insight as to why we may not be seeing a larger effect of that intervention and of that program. So there's certainly a need for more research and evaluations on programming for girls in the juvenile justice system, and as well as looking at potentially some more contextual factors, especially since we're not seeing necessarily really large reductions in recidivism, is that there's likely other things that are going on that might not be necessarily addressed in this particular intervention that could be useful to look at in future kind of correctional programming and intervention for girls. So as with all studies, we certainly have a number of kind of limitations in terms of the data that we have and kind of the conclusions that we're able to draw. And really kind of one of the biggest limitations, and one thing that we would like to have a discussion about and even hear from all of you about some of the work that you've done, is any barriers that you might have had in terms of kind of conducting evaluations using existing data. So both of these data sets, the quantitative data as well as the qualitative data, the quantitative at least are based on kind of existing records from the juvenile court system, and that qualitative data was from another study about girls, but it wasn't specifically about family-based interventions for justice-involved girls. In addition to that, kind of thought about some of the barriers potentially to conducting these kinds of evaluations using existing data. We also only have a sample of adjudicated girls, so we don't have data, unfortunately, on boys who also receive this intervention, which they do in this particular court system. So we're not able to necessarily look at gender differences in the effectiveness of this intervention. We also don't have any interview data with program participants, which certainly as community psychologists, we would probably highlight that would be important to understand participant experiences, both youth and families who are receiving these services. And kind of finally, I think that even, from kind of stepping back from a methods kind of perspective, is different ways in which we kind of can integrate both quantitative and qualitative data, and kind of some of the limitations in terms of kind of reporting these complex findings, kind of both to academic audiences as well as back to our community partners as well. And then kind of our final thought that hopefully can be an open up discussion kind of after this is kind of how we can, since we originally kind of did this study, I think really from more of a criminal justice perspective, even though we have, shared community psychology values, is, how we might be able to kind of align or contextualize some of these findings kind of from a community psychology perspective, and kind of maybe what's missing and what we might be able to explore kind of moving forward. All right, and that is all we have. So I know Laura might have been, I don't know if you have any questions from them, or if we just want to open this up. Okay.
Nice.
Thanks so much, Val and Laura. That was really great. So one of the questions I think that Carolyn had early on, it looks like Laura typed a comment to it, but I think it might be helpful. I know we have some people on at least we did have someone on the phone, but I think just to talk, to help us understand how people got access to the intervention. So Carolyn had asked, was this court mandated, or how were folks how do they get the intervention or not?
Yeah, so the intervention was assigned to youth in a couple of different ways. So youth might have either received so this is a court mandated program, and youth would either receive them if a youth came onto probation and the juvenile court officer was working with that youth and realized there was some other stuff going on in the home, right? This isn't, and I think for the most part, most of us understand that delinquency does not occur, kind of in a vacuum, right? There's a lot of context to what's going on. But oftentimes youth and their families would be assigned a caseworker in this particular program if they noticed there was a lot of maybe dysfunction in the home, if there had been any kind of issues of maybe neglect or abuse, whether or not that had been substantiated by kind of the child welfare system, as well as youth who go to the court-run school. So all youth that are involved in the court-run school also will receive family support service as well, at least for a period of 90 days. So yes, it's all kind of court mandated, but it's done in a way kind of on a case-by-case basis. And this particular court system will also use those kind of standardized, validated risk measures to make some of those decisions around kind of who gets what service. So for the most part, youth who are receiving family support services are also scoring pretty high in those family risk factors areas.
But just one point of clarification there. It sounds like you were able to match enough kids who had similar risk who didn't receive the intervention. Okay.
Exactly. So when we looked at the groups prior to matching, we saw that youth who received, for example, the family intervention were scoring higher in that family risk and need domain. But so there were about 100, I think it was 153 girls was our final sample. And then we had a sample of about 800 or 900 girls on probation during that same point in time who did not receive the program, but we were able to look at their kind of patterns of risk and need and then match and create a match sample using that propensity score matching framework to at least minimize that particular kind of selection bias issue between those two groups.
Great. So one of the other pieces for conversation that was actually raised by both Chris and Gail, and I don't want to overspeak or overstep, but I'll try and kind of sum up what they brought up in the chat box. And then Chris and Gail, I invite you to kind of chime in and what your thoughts are around this. And this might be a more robust conversation here. So Chris just asked the extent to which the cultural, what was the cultural perspective used in developing the parenting program, and to what extent then does it kind of fit with the context in which it's being implemented? And Gail also raised a related concern around kind of the cultural background of practitioners' perspectives, and then versus the girls and the families, and how that might impact the patterns that you saw.
Yeah, that is, I think, a really great point. And I'd like to kind of hear, I think this kind of goes in some ways to kind of that last slide around kind of some of these barriers, kind of working with kind of court systems, especially so a couple thoughts. One, I feel like I don't have like a substantive answer kind of to that question, because I don't necessarily know, because that was not included kind of in kind of the broader evaluation and the data that we have access to. But certainly we know as community psychologists that their perspectives and their own cultural background and their own values are going to shape kind of how they're delivering services and kind of the context of those services. So that's kind of one piece that, and because we also don't have kind of data and information from youth and from their families who received this particular intervention, we can't really speak to what the extent to which that the intervention was or was not effective, or what worked and what didn't work, kind of in what ways. So kind of one, I'd be interested in kind of getting a take on from all of you about kind of your own, and maybe if you've encountered this in your own work, if you don't necessarily kind of have that particular kind of that rich information to be able to kind of contextualize that in terms of the intervention or your evaluation work, how might we address that? Because that is certainly kind of an important kind of point that I think we would probably want to address as we begin to kind of write this, or whether or not it makes sense to kind of try to kind of gather more data and more information kind of to be able to kind of fill in those pieces. So I don't know if you need to add to that.
Yeah, I think for follow-up data, it might make sense to try to get a hold of some of the manuals that have been developed, because if we look at the history of parenting interventions, we've seen limited impact of parenting interventions that were developed from a different cultural context in which they were implemented, right? And oftentimes there's sort of an assumption of what best parenting practices are that look very different depending on the cultural context. That's one of the things that sort of immediately comes to mind here. I also think about the qualitative data that I see presented there, and the perspective of the probation officers, who often have a very stereotyped view of offenders and people they're working with, and very pessimistic beliefs about the people that they're working with, and oftentimes an assumption that people and families are sort of at fault. And that's what I see happening in the data there, in the qualitative data. The last thing I want to mention is that what I hear in the qualitative data is that there may be goals that are perhaps presented to the families, and the families pick from those goals. So that's different than like a motivational interviewing model, which is what we see tends to work better in behavioral change interventions in general. I don't know how those tend to work in family change interventions, but if we apply some of those same principles, it seems to be that people are more likely to change behavior if they themselves identify the goals that they have in life, where they want to be, and how their behaviors are aligning with those goals, and then identifying themselves what may be obstacles to achieving those goals, and therefore what they need to change, right? And so it seems to be a very sort of like top-down model, sort of, instead of working with people and identifying barriers.
Absolutely. Yeah, and one thing, Chris, in your point about kind of the things that were kind of striking to you in terms of especially the qualitative data, and just a few of the quotes that we shared with all of you, is that there are these kind of some kind of victim blaming undertones to how probation officers and judges and folks who are working in the court system are actually talking about girls and their families and working with them. So that certainly will shape, I think, their perspective, and two, even how they might be delivering these services. And one thing, I guess, one point when maybe folks can give me their insight around kind of how you even kind of when you work with the various systems and stakeholders that you do work with, kind of how might you report back these sorts of findings? In my experience, in doing some evaluations and kind of quantitative evaluations with this particular court system, they're very open to hearing about what's working really well, right? They get very excited when they see like, oh yeah, that particular program has, been reduces recidivism rates. And of course it does. Of course it does. That means we're doing a great job, and let's continue this. And then it gets a little bit trickier when you start to show, well, there aren't really significant differences. We don't see a large effect size of this particular intervention. And certainly that's in part due to some of the limited scope of the data and the design. But there also might be things we might want to do in terms of kind of improving intervention and improving services. And then I think it can get a little bit even more muddier and complex when we're trying to report back some qualitative findings, especially when there are, like I mentioned before, some of those kind of victim blaming undertones. So I guess I'm wondering, maybe from all of you, kind of one, what your thoughts are on that, and two, even from your own experiences working with stakeholders, kind of how you might kind of frame and shape kind of results and findings, kind of given what you have and what you're working with, and not trying to upset everyone.
This is Gail. I'm a doctoral student, but I also had done my internship at a nonprofit working with unemployed and underemployed individuals, and they ranged in age from 18 to 60. Many of them had, their barriers were, had criminal backgrounds. The area in which they live, the zip code, the lack of jobs, lack of transportation, that sort of thing. But my role as a counselor was to work with them clinically on the different things that are challenges for them, such as anger management. And there was two of us, me, who I looked like the community, and my counterpart, who was a white male. And what we found, him and I found, that they were more open to me. They told me more about their lives and their experiences versus what they would tell him. And he noted that. And so I realized that it is very critical to, even in my approach to each person, was to look at them across their lifespan and not pass judgment on them. And I think what I saw and what the in your last slide with your examples, it was more victim blaming. And I had a much more, I don't know what his style was, but I know I always had a much more inclusive perspective and creating that safe space for them to be able to talk to me and open up to me. So I'm very concerned. I mean, I love the idea that you did a mixed methods, because that's what I want to do, but I want to look at best practices in Baltimore City. So I'm really going to get more into what you guys have done. But I do think that it's very important to include the young girls' perspectives, their parents' perspectives. Maybe what the professionals are saying may not, and believe doesn't necessarily gel with them. And I think that's a very important piece that has to be considered. Their voices and their parents' voices have to be considered.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if I could follow up on that, I think that there could be a couple different ways to have those voices included. One would be follow-up data from a focus group, perhaps on the results, to get people's perspectives, or even an informal advisory group, and including the interpretation of that advisory group or advisory council about the data. And I think that provides you an opportunity to not only get some different perspectives about the results and the interventions, but also provide an alternative voice other than your own that can provide that interpretation of the results, right? So that you are more likely to be able to maintain these relationships with stakeholders you have, because it isn't necessarily your interpretation, but it's interpretation of other stakeholders and their reaction to the data.
Absolutely, that's a great idea.
Yeah, and I think building off of what Chris just said as well, when you ask the question kind of like, what are some strategies around presenting unflattering findings back to partners and having them still want to be your partner? So that was one of the pieces, exactly what Chris just said, in terms of presenting patterns and then working with your community partners to interpret them. Like, we saw these things, why did we see these things? What do you think? And allowing them to really engage with the data, with the findings themselves, and give language. So instead of prescribing what this means or what they should do, allowing them to really do that. A couple of the other things that I do in presenting unflattering findings back to partners and hoping they still want to be my partner is, one is to normalize the findings. So while these aren't what we expected or what we hoped for, we see similar patterns in other communities too. So just to say, like, it's not just you, this is happening elsewhere. That doesn't mean it's good or okay, but that you're not alone in this, and that lots of communities are struggling. And then the other thing that I do is not only placing it kind of in the broader context, looking across jurisdictions and communities, but placing it within that specific jurisdiction's system, right? So I think a lot of times, particularly in working with folks within the criminal justice system, they want to know, like, who said what and who did what, so we can figure out who's responsible for this and hold that individual person or individual agency accountable. But knowing that the criminal justice system, within that system itself has so many different interconnected, interdependent components, as well as all the other systems like the medical system and other places that tend to interface, and school systems that interface with the criminal justice system. And so saying like, we see these patterns here within this kind of agency, but this agency is gaining access to these individuals through this other partner, and just kind of saying, we're looking at this really through this systemic lens. And it's not just one individual or one agency making these decisions, but all these other pieces contribute to it. And trying to unpack and explain some of those pieces. So I think those three strategies around interpreting with my partners, normalizing the findings, and then placing the findings in their broader systemic context. Like it's not just one person or one agency where we're seeing not so good things happen.
I'd like to highlight one part of what Jessica just said, is the kind of normalizing findings. So I've had a pretty similar experience doing an evaluation of FFT and realizing that the quantitative data is not going to tell the story that everyone's hoping for. But it seems like everyone around the table recognizes that these are the tough kids. And it sounds like in your case, that's also true. You know, the kids getting this program have been flagged as being particularly at risk. There are funding mechanisms through OJJDP that echo that in the literature. We know some of these kids are harder to move the needle on than others, and so they target funding to those groups. And so it seems like it facilitates our conversations where it says, you know, we know these are tough kids. We still have to help them, you know, and how do we, recognizing the particularly at-risk group we have, and like Jessica was saying, this at-risk group is all over the country, you know, how do we keep moving forward given the, you know, the extra challenges?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and your data don't suggest that it doesn't work, right? It suggests that it works to a small effect size, right? But so the story could be that the intervention works. Now, how can we make it even stronger? And there is evidence there may be some evidence in the data or in the follow-ups and ways that we can make it even stronger.
That's a great point. Thanks.
And I agree with the data. I'm very impressed with the qualitative and the quantitative piece, and it could be stronger. And what I would be looking for is how can I adapt that, you know, your particular study and way of doing it to the young people in Baltimore City in my environment, and then to be able to take it and take it to another environment such as Raleigh, North Carolina. That's what I'm looking for, is to be able to adapt something that's solid and retrofit it or fit it to something that is happening on the ground where I'm at.
And kind of along those lines and what Chris was just saying earlier, I think that could also be an opportunity for your stakeholders and community members to get involved. So I've been working on a project in the community here that's kind of somewhat related, looking at risk factors for adolescents and some of the risky behaviors that they're involved in. And we've been presenting the data to the community members and having those stakeholders say, okay, well, of the 10 problems that we're seeing, how can we pick out the top 3 that we want to focus on, and what strategies might we be able to develop? And so if you're saying the intervention seems to work, but we want to make it better, maybe it's including some more cultural perspectives, maybe it's adapting it in some way, that could also be an opportunity for your stakeholders to really get involved in how can we improve it and make it better.
So we have about 4 minutes left, and Val, I think you were just writing notes down. But maybe to wrap up in these last few minutes that we have together, and folks don't have other questions, is I know one of the things you said you wanted to kind of talk about is community psychology and its interface with all of this. So could you just tell us a bit more about where you thought you saw a where you thought you saw a disconnect? Or was it that you were thinking about, like, how do I reshape this to tell this story to community psychologists, or how do I better impart community psychology values, or like what exactly was it where you saw an opportunity?
Yeah, I think kind of a little bit of all of that, actually, Jess, like all those kind of points that you just highlighted. I mean, I think primarily, especially as we're kind of working through kind of, well, what does this mean and what information is still missing? And kind of going back to my roots as a community psychologist, like one thing, and this is a point I think in various ways all of you have kind of pointed out and have given me some additional ways to maybe think about and even reshape this, is is making sure that, you know, folks' voice is included in this particular process. And that's, I think, one thing that I've learned through trying to work on this evaluation project is that, yes, we have a few different rich sources of data that can tell us some sort of story. But I think one thing that has been concerning to some degree is the fact that there are missing voices in this, and it might be perhaps the most important voices to understand kind of the context and the story of what's going on. And those are, you know, the girls who are receiving this intervention as well as their families. So one thing that I feel like I'm kind of reckoning with as well is, you know, making sure that that this is kind of the most accurate kind of, you know, empirical data driven story that we can tell, but also that, you know, that we're not further, you know, disenfranchising anybody, and making sure that their voices are also included and kind of at the table. So that's kind of one important piece that I've been kind of working with is, okay, well, now what can we do next? Because it is important to do evaluations on these kinds of services for girls in the system, because we don't have a lot of good research evidence on what works for them. But also, you know, that piece of making sure that they're also included and their voices are included in this story as well. So that's kind of the biggest piece, I would say.
I was gonna wait because we have 1 minute, so I didn't want to take up the last bit of space. But Val, when you were just talking, one of the things that I thought of that in terms of even stepping back from this particular evaluation of this particular program, but we hear you really talk, what you just said around wanting to give voice and thinking about what's kind of the master narrative or potential counter narratives, and how do we give voice back to folks. So I think even one of the things that could be interesting to do is to go back to these qualitative interviews themselves and kind of trying to answer the focal question of what are the stories that we tell about these girls? Like how do we tell their stories? And even doing a focus group in your current context, whether it be the same place where this original evaluation came from or not, where you work with girls and young women who have been justice system involved, and allow them to read the stories and say, and how are these stories different than the stories that you tell about yourself? So even if it is a totally different sample, but just kind of framing it in this, like, what is the master narrative that we have here, and what are other narratives? How do we allow people to kind of reclaim their own stories and their own voice in this?
That's a great idea.
So it's 1:30. So I will invite, if anybody has anything else they just want to add before we sign off.
I just wanted to say that this was a really great learning community, and I appreciated being part of it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Valerie. Thanks, Laura. This was really, really fantastic. And I will be reaching out to all of you very soon as we look to plan February's learning community. And as always, please reach out to one another if you saw the opportunity for connection.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.